The economies of one of these countries are on the verge of collapsing in the coming years. Blackouts, riots, and poverty-related looting are common in South Africa. South Africa's biggest problem is inequality, which is at its greatest level in decades due to the richest 10% of the population having more than 85% of household wealth. The top 3,500 South Africans own more than the bottom 32 million. This is over half the country's population. This country's youth unemployment rate is over 60%. The wealth and poverty gaps are clear. South African adolescents have turned to violent crime to survive. South Africa is known for its violent criminal riots and widespread gang warfare. Demand for vital national services is approaching crisis levels. Cape Town International Airport suspended flights owing to jet fuel shortages. The world's worst education system is due to government underfunding. Over 25% of kids who had been in school for more than 6 years couldn't read, according to recent testing. Thus, future South Africans will be woefully unprepared for future challenges. In the face of all these mounting challenges, the government has a history of avoiding problems by inventing new ones, such as when they restricted alcohol during lockdowns, putting thousands of people's livelihoods at risk for no apparent reason. Academics predict another recession in South Africa this year due to structural issues. Why now in South Africa? South Africa's economy has collapsed due to massive corruption. It affects the entire nation. Eskom, the state monopoly power company, has been corrupt for years, postponing or canceling vital infrastructure repairs to siphon off funds, leaving South Africa's energy system physically incapable of supplying a hungry, growing nation. South Africa's 12-hour blackouts have worsened in recent years. 2022 had 4.5 times as many as 2021, and 2023 is expected to be worse. Corruption blinds South Africa, so top-down reform is slow. Instead, top executives are preoccupied with petty power battles and conspiracies, with one of Eskom's former CEOs being poisoned with cyanide, likely by his company's rivals, since he was fired months later after disputing corruption charges. South Africa has some hope. Babita Deokaran resists. She fought South African corruption for 30 years as a public official. She exposed a crooked hospital system that took 500 million South African rand, or $30 million. After leaving off her daughter at school on August 23, 2021, Amber Beda received her award despite being a whistleblower. After the investigations, the hitman escaped prosecution. North Africa isn't doing well 6,500 kilometers away. Tunisia, with its poor economic outlook, best illustrates how rising costs and stagnant wages have created a poverty death cycle. You know, the country's public debt was already at 70% of GDP, a shocking amount that has subsequently increased to nearly 90% in a few years. Thus, poverty rates rose to 15% just 10 years after the Tunisian Revolution. Despite the drought, Tunisians are facing shortages of fuel, flour, bread, sugar, and other essentials. What type of administration can the Tunisian people turn to in their time of need after the 2011 revolution's democratic principles were rapidly set aside after a dictatorial coup ended Tunisia's democratic experiment? Kais Saied became president after a bloodless coup a few years after being elected. He arrested several political opponents. Political upheaval isn't helping him arrest social media critics. Protests have halted the economy. And the government's remedy is a tough and lengthy austerity program that cuts fundamental support for Tunisians. Subsidies and clean drinking water have decreased. Subsidies will be cut 26.4%, raising water prices $23 nationwide, and taxes 12.5%. These planned reforms persuade the IMF to proceed with a $1.8 billion emergency loan. But recent instability has caused delays and cut all of Tunisia's tourism money. So few creditors want to invest in a country on the brink of economic collapse, causing Tunisia's credit rating to be downgraded again. This suggests Tunisia will fail on its loans. Tunisia's new dictatorship may not survive the impending crisis. Tunisia is close to bankruptcy, while other countries are much further along. Lebanon has struggled for years. Thus, 80% are poor. Clean water shortages have caused one of the deadliest cholera pandemics in decades. Lebanon's currency fell since this is their worst crisis. The government devalued the currency by 90%, but it hasn't caught up to inflation. Banks now restrict savings withdrawals to high amounts. No one has ever received their money back without robbing the bank at gunpoint. Why has Lebanon's inflation skyrocketed? It's like the economy was nearly destroyed. Causes vary. Lebanon's elites blame foreign factors like Syria's civil war and the COVID-19 pandemic for their economic woes. The World Bank has called Lebanon's inflation a Ponzi scheme-like depression perpetrated by the financial elite. Because the Lebanese government spent years making hollow promises to investors in exchange for enormous debts before the Syrian war and plague. New loans gave the currency the appearance of strength. In a classic Ponzi scheme, they took out new loans to pay off old ones. When Lebanon could no longer justify new loans, it ended spectacularly. The war and pandemic spooked investors and sank the economy. Before the crisis, Lebanon's debt was 171% of GDP. The economy collapsed, leaving Lebanon to clean up. The 2020 Beirut blast demonstrated corruption's catastrophic consequences. Port officials missed the dangerous dumping of volatile explosives in an abandoned warehouse to save money, resulting in 218 deaths. Over 7,000 were hurt. Without a plan, Lebanon's predicament will deteriorate. The IMF has not accepted Lebanon's multi-billion-dollar rescue request. Thus, investors are wary of investing in a government that has defrauded its citizens for decades. Without major reforms and bailouts, Lebanon's future is dismal. Due to long-term economic challenges, Nigeria beats everyone. Nigeria's paper note shortage generated a new issue. 55% of Nigerians cannot bank, leaving them without money during an economic crisis. Yesterday's lively markets were empty. Nobody has money. People wait hours at banks and ATMs to get enough money for the day. What caused this? Nigeria's government boldly replaced all high-denomination notes in October. The government only gave them 3 months before the old notes became worthless. The government didn't produce enough new notes, so there was a rush. It was part of a misguided plan to cashless Nigeria. Despite the months of disruption, funding is still needed. When the currency ran out, the laws switched to bartering, forcing me to meet the deadline earlier and earlier. Private sector development stopped for the first time in 3 years. Why does the government want to fix what's not broken? It's another sham policy to make Nigeria's administration appear to be fighting corruption. Cash makes money laundering and lower-level corruption harder, but it doesn't stop the worst institutional corruption at the top. Former Federation Accountant General Ahmed Idris is an example. His corruption arrest occurred in May 2022. He was accused of masterminding a fraud plot that stole $236 million from state finances, likely not with cash. Since corruption permeates society, Nigeria pays 170 million bribes annually. It's wrecking a fragile economy. The number of poor Nigerians has risen to 133 million, according to recent estimates. Sausages are popular in oil-producing countries, especially for fuel. Never again. However, politicians like Ahmed Idris have created a system to sell oil cheaply to Western businesses while pocketing a portion. Even if the newly elected government aims to save the country with big reforms, the people pay the price. Rising debt repayments may soon surpass the economy's ability to absorb them, making it tough to escape this all-too-familiar debt trap. Based on Nigerian bond market falls, financial analysts doubt they can. Nigeria has a way out, whereas Pakistan's future looks bleak. Economy is critical, politicians are fighting, and people need help. It's disastrous. Fuel shortages start the problems. Job losses were worrying as rising prices prevented many enterprises from operating. Fuel shortages shut down 1,600 textile mills in October 2022, costing 5 million jobs. Pakistan's inflation is 40%, the highest since the 1970s, as unemployment soars and salaries stagnate. Inflation and unemployment have left millions without food, shelter, and health care. As if that wasn't enough, huge floods in recent months have submerged 1/3 of the country, killing or hurting 15,000 people and displacing 8 million. Thus, a massive debt burden is suffocating the economy, framing the entire crisis. Pakistan's debt has grown every 5 years for 25 years. The 14% debt growth much exceeds the 3% GDP growth. Thus, Pakistan's economy would soon collapse. Thus, the government has dangerously low funds. Pakistan's government has been waiting for a $1.1 billion bailout to maintain order, with barely $3 billion for a population of nearly 230 million. The larger rescue operation includes this. However, the IMF has been holding it back, demanding harsh measures like tax increases and fuel price hikes to prevent a collapse. The Pakistani rupee fell 9.6% on the day the IMF's measures were implemented, poisoning Pakistan's recovery. Because of this, the government is struggling to recover. The crisis has also shattered politics. Imran Khan spearheaded anti-government protests. Imran Khan, Pakistan's former prime minister, is spearheading a march of his supporters from Lahore to Islamabad. He demands early elections, threatening the current government. The authorities arrested the previous prime minister and used tear gas and water to disperse protests. It's understandable that many blame the government. Corruption and overborrowing have bankrupted the nation. Mass poverty, an unhappy population, and a disorganized administration make utter collapse more likely every day. Pakistan's 230 million people are in dire need, and a further dip will cause a humanitarian disaster. Pakistan is a nuclear state, thus its power struggles are continuously followed. Pakistan is ripe for a coup, and a new government might upset the delicate power balance between Pakistan, India, and China. Pakistan is the closest to bankruptcy of the countries we've discussed due to their escalating crisis. That's all for now. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to our channel BizVentures and click the bell icon.